The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Prince William sat in the familiar sitting room where his mother once held court. The walls still held echoes of Princess Diana's laughter, and today, those memories felt particularly close. His brother Harry had arrived earlier, and together they had made a decision that had been years in the making. It was time to share the real Diana with the world, not the version painted by newspapers or biographers, but the mother they knew and loved. William adjusted his tie nervously as the camera crew finished setting up their equipment. He had given countless interviews over the years, but this felt different. This wasn't about duty or royal obligations. This was about honoring the woman who had shaped them into the men they had become. Harry, ever the more relaxed of the two, was already chatting with the documentary director, his easy smile masking the emotional weight of what they were about to do. The idea for this documentary had come to them during one of their regular walks through the gardens at Kensington Palace. They had been discussing how their mother was often portrayed in the media, sometimes as a saint, sometimes as a troubled soul, but rarely as the complete person she actually was. Diana had been funny, mischievous, deeply caring, and yes, sometimes sad. She had been human in the most beautiful way possible. As they settled into the comfortable chairs where they would spend the next several hours, William found himself thinking about how his mother would have reacted to this moment. She would have been nervous, he knew, but also proud that her sons were finally ready to share her story on their own terms. Diana had always believed in the power of storytelling, in the importance of showing vulnerability and truth. Harry reached over and squeezed his brother's shoulder, a gesture that transported William back 30 years to when they were just little boys seeking comfort from each other during their mother's more difficult moments. They had learned early that they were each other's closest allies, a bond forged not just by blood but by shared experience and loss. The documentary director, a woman Diana would have liked for her warmth and genuine interest in people's stories, began with simple questions. She asked them to describe their earliest memory of their mother. William closed his eyes for a moment, and suddenly he was 6 years old again, watching his mother apply lipstick in her dressing room mirror while humming a song he couldn't quite remember now. Diana had been getting ready for a state dinner, he recalled, wearing a stunning blue gown that sparkled when she moved. But what he remembered most clearly wasn't the dress or the diamonds. It was how she had caught him watching her in the mirror and had immediately knelt down to his level, not caring that she might wrinkle her perfect dress. She had dabbed a tiny bit of lipstick on his cheek and declared him her handsome prince before sending him off to find his brother. Harry's first memory was different, but equally telling of Diana's character. He remembered being 4 years old and having a spectacular tantrum about something he couldn't even recall now. He had thrown himself on the floor of the drawing room, screaming and crying completely out of control. Instead of calling for a nanny or becoming angry, Diana had simply lain down on the floor beside him and begun making silly faces until his tears turned to giggles. The brothers looked at each other as they shared these memories, both struck by how perfectly these early recollections captured who their mother had been. She had never been too formal, too busy, or too important to meet them where they were, whether that was on their level physically or emotionally. As the morning wore on, more memories began to surface. William talked about how his mother had insisted on taking him and Harry to McDonald's, despite the security concerns it raised. Diana had been determined that her sons experience normal childhood pleasures, even if those experiences had to be carefully orchestrated. She would order Happy Meals for all 3 of them and would eat her chicken nuggets with the same enthusiasm as her young sons, chatting with other families as if she were just another mom out for lunch with her children. Harry remembered the way Diana would sing in the car during their drives to school or to various engagements. She had a lovely voice, he said, but more than that, she had been uninhibited in her joy. She would belt out pop songs on the radio, encouraging her sons to join in, turning their official car into a mobile concert venue. The police protection officers had grown accustomed to these impromptu performances, often hiding smiles as they listened to the Princess of Wales enthusiastically singing along to whatever was popular that week. These weren't the grand gestures that made headlines, William reflected. These were the small, daily acts of love that had made Diana such an extraordinary mother. She had understood that childhood was precious and fleeting, and she had been determined to give her sons as much normalcy as possible within the constraints of their unusual life. The documentary crew captured every word, every smile, every pause as the brothers delved deeper into their memories. This was just the beginning of their story, they knew. There were so many more layers to explore, so many more facets of Diana to reveal. But already in just these first few hours, they felt they were beginning to paint a picture of the woman who had been not just the people's princess, but their mother, their biggest supporter, and their greatest loss. As they broke for lunch, William and Harry walked together through the gardens where they had played as children under Diana's watchful eye. The weight of sharing these memories felt both heavy and liberating. They were finally ready to tell the world about the real Diana, the woman behind the public image, the mother who had loved them unconditionally and had taught them everything they knew about compassion, service, and finding joy in life's simple pleasures. The afternoon session began with a different energy. William and Harry had spent their lunch break walking through Hyde Park, something Diana used to do with them on quiet Sunday mornings when royal duties permitted. Now, as they settled back into their chairs, they seemed more relaxed, more ready to dive into the deeper memories that had shaped their understanding of their mother's complex world. Harry spoke first about Diana's mischievous side, a quality that had sometimes gotten her into trouble with palace officials, but had delighted her sons. He remembered the summer when Diana decided they needed to learn about real life and had taken them on a secret expedition to Thorpe Park, the popular theme park. The security detail had been beside themselves with worry, but Diana had been determined that her boys experience the thrill of roller coasters and the simple pleasure of waiting in line like ordinary children. She had worn a baseball cap and sunglasses, thinking this would be sufficient disguise, Harry recalled with a laugh. Of course, people had recognized her almost immediately, but instead of creating chaos, the other park visitors had seemed to understand the specialness of the moment. Parents had quietly kept their children from mobbing the princess, allowing William and Harry to enjoy their day while still approaching Diana warmly for brief conversations. William remembered how his mother had screamed louder than anyone on the Nemesis roller coaster, clutching both her son's hands and laughing until tears streamed down her face. She had been fearless in so many ways, he said, but roller coasters had terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. That day at Thorpe Park had become one of his most treasured memories because it perfectly captured Diana's determination to prioritize her children's happiness over protocol. The conversation turned to Diana's work with charities, something both princes had witnessed firsthand from an early age. Harry described accompanying his mother to hospitals and hospices when he was barely old enough to understand why people were sick or sad. Diana had never shielded her sons from difficult realities, believing instead that exposure to other struggles would develop their empathy and sense of responsibility. He remembered one particular visit to a children's hospital when he was about 8 years old. A little girl, probably no older than 5, had been too shy to speak to Diana directly, but had kept staring at her with wide, wondering eyes. Instead of moving on to the next patient, Diana had sat on the floor beside the child's bed and had simply waited. She had pulled out a small toy from her purse, something she always carried for such moments, and had begun playing quietly, not pushing for interaction, but simply being present. Gradually, the little girl had begun to play too, and soon they were giggling together over a simple game of peek-boo. Harry had watched this unfold and had understood, even at his young age, that his mother possessed something special, an ability to connect with people that went beyond her royal title or her beauty. She could make anyone feel seen and valued, whether they were world leaders or frightened children in hospital beds. William shared his own observations about Diana's charitable work, particularly her groundbreaking involvement with AIDS patients in the 1980s when fear and misinformation about the disease were rampant. He had been too young to fully understand the controversy at the time, but he remembered the heated discussions between his mother and palace advisors. Diana had been advised against her planned visit to the first AIDS ward at Middlesex Hospital, but she had been resolute. He recalled overhearing a phone conversation where Diana had told someone, her voice firm but kind, that she didn't care about the political implications. People were suffering, she had said, and they needed to know that they weren't forgotten or untouchable. The famous photograph of Diana shaking hands with an AIDS patient without gloves had been spontaneous, William explained. She had removed her gloves simply because she felt it was more important to offer genuine human contact than to follow cautious protocols. Both brothers remembered how Diana would often bring them along to her charitable engagements, not for photo opportunities, but to teach them about service and compassion. She had wanted them to understand that their privilege came with responsibility, that they had been given platform and resources not for their own benefit, but to help others. Harry described watching his mother comfort a young mother at a homeless shelter, remembering how Diana had listened without judgment as the woman explained how she had ended up on the streets with her 2 children. Diana had knelt down to play with the children while their mother spoke, understanding instinctively that removing the children's anxiety would help their mother feel more comfortable sharing her story. After the visit, Diana had spent the car ride home explaining to Harry and William why it was important not to make assumptions about people's circumstances. Homelessness could happen to anyone, she had told them. Job loss, illness, domestic violence, mental health struggles. Any number of factors could lead a family to lose their home. Her role, she had explained, wasn't to judge, but to listen, to offer support, and to use her position to bring attention to problems that needed solving. These lessons had clearly taken root in both princes, as evidenced by their own charitable work as adults. But hearing them describe Diana's approach revealed the depth of her influence on their worldview. She hadn't simply told them to be compassionate. She had shown them what compassion looked like in action. The interview continued with stories about Diana's relationship with the media, a complex dynamic that had both elevated her charitable causes and invaded her privacy. William spoke thoughtfully about watching his mother navigate the constant attention, how she had tried to use media interest to shine light on important issues while struggling with the personal cost of fame. He remembered Diana sitting him down when he was about 12 to explain why photographers followed them everywhere. She had been honest about the challenges, but had also emphasized the opportunities. When people took pictures of her visiting a landmine victim, she had explained, it meant that millions of people would learn about the landmine problem. The attention was intrusive and sometimes painful, but it could also be a powerful tool for good. Harry added that Diana had taught them early to distinguish between the photographers who treated them with respect and those who were more aggressive. She had shown them how to be polite but firm, how to protect their privacy while still acknowledging that public interest came with their position. These were sophisticated lessons for young children, but Diana had understood that preparation was better than protection when it came to helping her sons navigate their unique circumstances. As the afternoon drew to a close, both princes reflected on how these early experiences with their mother had shaped their approach to their own public roles. Diana had shown them that being royal wasn't about being separate from or above ordinary people, but about using whatever advantages they had been given to serve others. She had demonstrated that authenticity and vulnerability could be strengths rather than weaknesses, and that connecting with people on a human level was more important than maintaining formal distance. The documentary crew had captured hours of intimate memories, but William and Harry both knew they had only scratched the surface of who Diana had been. There were still so many stories to tell, so many facets of her personality to explore. Tomorrow they would continue, delving into some of the more difficult memories, the times when Diana's struggles had been visible to her young sons, and how those experiences had ultimately deepened their understanding of human resilience and the importance of seeking help when life became overwhelming. The third day of filming brought a shift in atmosphere. William and Harry had spent the previous evening looking through old photo albums and home videos, preparing themselves for conversations that would require more emotional courage. Today, they would discuss the more challenging aspects of Diana's life, the struggles that had sometimes cast shadows over their childhood, but had also taught them invaluable lessons about resilience and seeking help. Harry began by addressing something that had been written about extensively, but never discussed by them directly: their mother's battle with bulimia and depression. He spoke carefully, his voice gentle, but determined to set the record straight about what they had actually witnessed as children versus what had been speculated about in countless books and articles. He remembered being very young, maybe 6 years old, and noticing that his mother sometimes seemed sad in a way that went deeper than ordinary disappointment or frustration. Diana had been remarkably good at maintaining her cheerful demeanor around her sons, but children, Harry noted, are more perceptive than adults often realize. He had sensed that something was troubling her long before he had words to describe what he was observing. William nodded, adding that their mother had eventually been honest with them about her struggles, though she had waited until they were old enough to understand. When he was about 14 and Harry was 12, Diana had sat them down for what she called an important conversation. She had explained that sometimes her mind played tricks on her, making her feel worthless or hopeless even when there was no logical reason for these feelings. She had used simple analogies to help them understand, William recalled. Mental illness, she had told them, was like having a broken leg that no one could see. Just because the injury wasn't visible didn't mean it wasn't real or that it didn't require treatment and care. She had emphasized that seeking help for emotional struggles was just as important and brave as getting medical care for a physical injury. Harry spoke about how Diana's openness about her mental health struggles had actually strengthened their relationship rather than burdening them. She had taught them to recognize the signs when someone they cared about might be struggling, and she had shown them that it was possible to get help and feel better. Her honesty had demystified mental illness for them and had given them tools they would later use in their own lives and in their work supporting others. Both brothers acknowledged that Diana's struggles had sometimes been frightening for them as children. There had been periods when she seemed fragile, when they had felt a need to protect her rather than the other way around. But they emphasized that even during her most difficult times, Diana had never stopped being a loving, attentive mother. Her mental health challenges had affected her, but they hadn't defined her or diminished her capacity for love and joy. William shared a particularly poignant memory from when he was about 15. He had found his mother crying in her sitting room after what had clearly been a difficult day. Instead of pretending everything was fine or sending him away, Diana had invited him to sit with her and had explained that sometimes grown-ups needed to cry, just like children did. She had told him that sadness wasn't something to be ashamed of, that it was a normal human emotion that everyone experienced. What had struck him most about that moment, William reflected, wasn't his mother's tears, but her composure in explaining her feelings. She had managed to turn a moment of vulnerability into a teaching opportunity, showing him that it was possible to acknowledge difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. This conversation had occurred during some of the most challenging years of Diana's marriage, but she had found a way to use her struggles to help her son develop emotional intelligence and resilience. Harry discussed how Diana's openness about seeking professional help had normalized therapy for their family. She had never hidden the fact that she was working with counselors and therapists, and she had encouraged her sons to view mental health care as a normal part of taking care of themselves. This attitude had been revolutionary for the royal family at that time, when seeking help for emotional problems was often seen as a sign of weakness or failure. The conversation turned to Diana's relationship with their father, a topic both princes approached with careful thoughtfulness. They acknowledged that their parents' marriage had been troubled, but they emphasized their desire to speak about this period with respect for both their mother and father. Children of divorce, William pointed out, often have complex feelings about their parents' relationship, and their situation had been complicated by the intense public scrutiny. Harry spoke about his memories of the tension in the house during the worst periods of his parents' marriage. He had been very young, but He remembered the atmosphere changing when both parents were present. The way conversations became formal and careful. Diana had worked hard to shield her sons from the worst of the marital difficulties, but some things were impossible to hide completely. Both princes emphasized that despite the problems in their marriage, they had never doubted that both parents loved them deeply. Diana had been careful never to speak negatively about their father in front of them, even during the most difficult periods. She had understood that protecting her son's relationship with their father was more important than expressing her own hurt or anger. William shared a conversation he had with Diana when he was about 16, after his parents' divorce had been finalized. He had asked her directly whether she regretted marrying their father, and her answer had surprised him. She had told him that she could never regret a relationship that had given her her two sons, that William and Harry were the best things that had ever happened to her. Whatever pain she had experienced in her marriage, she had said, it had been worth it because it had brought them into her life. The interview moved to discussing Diana's dating life after her divorce, a period that had been heavily scrutinized by the media and had sometimes been challenging for her sons to navigate. Harry spoke honestly about his initial resistance to his mother dating, admitting that as a young teenager, he had hoped his parents might reconcile despite knowing intellectually that this was unlikely. Diana had been patient with her son's mixed feelings about her romantic relationships, understanding that it was natural for children to have complicated emotions about their divorced parent dating. She had introduced them slowly to the men she was seeing, never rushing them into relationships or expecting them to immediately embrace new people in her life. William recalled how Diana had always prioritized her son's comfort over her own romantic interests. If William or Harry expressed discomfort about a particular relationship, Diana would take their concerns seriously and would often pull back from dating someone if it was causing her children distress. This had sometimes meant she had sacrificed her own happiness for their emotional security, a choice both princes now recognized and appreciated as adults. The discussion of Diana's later relationships led naturally to conversations about her final years, when she had seemed to find more peace and confidence. Both William and Harry spoke about the changes they had observed in their mother during the last 2 years of her life. She had seemed more settled, more sure of herself and her place in the world. Harry remembered Diana talking about her future plans during their last summer together. She had been excited about her upcoming work with landmine victims, energized by the possibility of using her platform to address a global humanitarian crisis. She had also spoken about wanting to travel more with her sons, to show them different parts of the world and help them understand their responsibilities as global citizens. William added that Diana had seemed to be finding her voice as an independent woman during those final years. She was no longer defined primarily as the Princess of Wales or as someone's ex-wife, but was carving out her own identity as a humanitarian and a mother. This newfound confidence had been beautiful to witness, and it made her death all the more tragic because she had finally seemed to be becoming the person she was meant to be. As this session drew to a close, both princes reflected on how their mother's struggles had ultimately made them stronger and more empathetic. Diana's willingness to be vulnerable, to admit when she was struggling, and to seek help when she needed it had taught them lessons that extended far beyond their childhood. They had learned that strength wasn't about pretending to be invulnerable, but about having the courage to face difficulties honestly and to ask for support when needed. The fourth day of filming began with a heaviness that both brothers felt but didn't immediately acknowledge. They were approaching the most difficult part of their story, the final months of Diana's life and the aftermath of her death. The documentary director had suggested they could skip this part if it felt too painful, but both William and Harry had insisted that telling Diana's complete story meant confronting even the most heartbreaking chapters. William started by talking about the last conversation he had with his mother. It had been a phone call in the afternoon before she left for Paris, and he had been impatient to get off the phone because he was playing with his cousins at Balmoral Castle. Diana had called to say goodnight, as she always did when they were apart, and William remembered feeling annoyed that the call was interrupting his game. The conversation had been brief, maybe 5 minutes, and had ended with Diana telling him she loved him and would call again the next day. For years afterward, William had tortured himself with regret about that phone call. He wished he had talked longer, had told her more about what he had been doing, had said, "I love you too," instead of just "okay, bye, mummy." It had taken him a long time to understand that there was nothing unusual about a teenage boy being more interested in playing with friends and talking on the phone with his mother. Diana would have understood completely, he realized, because she had been a normal mother dealing with normal teenage behavior. Harry shared that his last conversation with Diana had been similarly routine. She had called him as well that evening, and he had been equally distracted by activities with his cousins. He remembered being mildly irritated that she was checking in again, since she had already called earlier in the day. Like William, he had kept the conversation short, and had ended it without any sense that it might be the last time he would hear his mother's voice. Both brothers spoke about how the ordinariness of these final conversations had actually become a source of comfort over time. Diana hadn't been calling with premonitions or desperate urgency. She had simply been being a mother, checking on her sons, maintaining the connection that had been the most important thing in her life. Their responses had been normal too. Teenagers being teenagers, secure in the knowledge that their mother would always be there. The news of Diana's accident had reached them in the early hours of the morning. William remembered being woken by their father, who had sat on his bed and had spoken in a voice that immediately told William something terrible had happened. The words "very seriously injured" had hung in the air, but William's 15-year-old mind had refused to process what this might mean. His mother was strong, he had thought. She would be okay. She had to be okay. Harry recalled feeling detached from the news, as if it were happening to someone else's family. At 12 years old, the concept of death was still abstract to him, especially when it involved someone as vital and present as his mother. Even when their father had returned with the news that Diana hadn't survived her injuries, Harry remembered feeling confused rather than devastated. How could someone who had been talking and laughing just hours before suddenly not exist anymore? The immediate aftermath had been a blur of adults making arrangements around them. William spoke about feeling like he was watching everything happen from a great distance, as if he were observing someone else's life. People kept asking if he was okay, but he didn't know how to answer because he didn't understand yet what okay could possibly mean in this new reality. Both brothers remembered the surreal experience of walking behind their mother's coffin during her funeral procession. Harry had focused on the sound of the horse's hooves on the pavement, using the rhythm to keep himself moving forward when every instinct told him to run away. William had looked straight ahead, afraid that if he looked at the crowds of mourners or the coffin itself, he might collapse. The most difficult part of the funeral, they both agreed, had been the moment when Elton John sang "Candle in the Wind." The song had been beautiful and fitting, but hearing it had made Diana's death feel final in a way that nothing else had. During the service, William had still harbored a secret hope that this might all be a terrible mistake, that somehow his mother might still be alive. But the song had forced him to confront the reality that Diana was gone forever. Harry spoke about the immediate changes in their daily life after Diana's death. Suddenly, there were no more phone calls checking on them, no more surprise visits when they were at school, no more of the casual physical affection that Diana had always provided. The absence of these small, constant expressions of love had been almost harder to bear than the grand gesture of grief surrounding them. William remembered feeling angry at the public outpouring of grief for his mother. While he understood that people genuinely loved Diana, it had felt intrusive to have the entire world grieving for someone who had been first and foremost his and Harry's mother. The flowers and messages had been well-intentioned, but they had also served as constant reminders that his private loss was being played out on a global stage. Both brothers discussed how differently they had processed their grief. William had become very private, burying his feelings and focusing intensely on his studies and eventual royal duties. He had felt responsible for carrying on Diana's legacy, while also protecting Harry from additional pain. Harry, on the other hand, had struggled more visibly, acting out in ways that concerned his family and sometimes attracted negative media attention. The conversation turned to how their grief had evolved over the years. William spoke about how becoming a father had given him new insight into Diana's love for him and Harry. Holding his own children had helped him understand the depth of what he had lost when Diana died. It had also made him more determined to ensure that his children would know their grandmother through the stories he and Harry could tell about her. Harry discussed how therapy had finally helped him process his grief as an adult. For years, he had avoided dealing with the trauma of losing his mother, thinking that pushing forward was the same as healing. It had taken him nearly 2 decades to understand that grief wasn't something to get over, but something to integrate into his life in a healthy way. Both princes emphasized that their mother's death had taught them important lessons about the fragility of life and the importance of expressing love while you have a chance. They had learned not to take relationships for granted and to say, "I love you," more often than might seem necessary. Diana's sudden death had shown them that ordinary conversations might be the last ones you have with someone. William shared how he had tried to keep Diana's memory alive for his children. He talked to Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis about their grandmother regularly, showing them photos and videos and telling them stories about her humor, her kindness, and her love of mischief. He wanted his children to know Diana not as the tragic figure from history books, but as the warm, loving woman who would have adored being their grandmother. Harry spoke about how his own journey to parenthood had been influenced by his desire to honor Diana's memory. He wanted to be the kind of parent Diana had been: present, engaged, and willing to prioritize his children's emotional needs over protocol or convenience. Losing his mother had taught him that time with loved ones was precious and not to be wasted on things that didn't truly matter. The interview session ended with both brothers reflecting on how Diana's death had ultimately brought them closer together. They had been each other's primary support system through an experience that few people could understand. Their shared loss had created an unbreakable bond between them, even during periods when their paths had diverged or when they had disagreed about other things. As they prepared for their final interview session, William and Harry both acknowledged that talking about their mother's death had been painful, but also healing. They had spent so many years protecting these memories, keeping their private grief separate from their public personas. But sharing these stories felt like another way of honoring Diana, of ensuring that the world understood not just how she had lived, but how deeply she had been loved and how profoundly her loss had affected those who loved her most. The final day of filming felt different from all the others. William and Harry had spent the week peeling back layers of memory and emotion, sharing stories they had never told publicly before. Now, as they settled into their chairs for the last time, there was a sense of completion mixed with the bittersweet realization that this chapter of remembering was coming to an end. The documentary director began by asking them to reflect on Diana's lasting legacy, both in their personal lives and in the wider world. William spoke first about how his mother had fundamentally changed the nature of royal service. Before Diana, royal charitable work had often been formal and distant, he explained. Diana had revolutionized this approach by bringing genuine emotion and personal connection to her public role. He described watching his mother hold AIDS patients, hug children in hospitals, and sit on the floor with homeless individuals. These weren't calculated gestures designed for good publicity, William emphasized. They were natural expressions of Diana's belief that everyone deserved dignity and human connection. She had shown that being royal didn't mean being untouchable, and this lesson had shaped how both he and Harry approached their own public service. Harry added that Diana's influence extended far beyond the royal family. She had changed how society talked about mental health, domestic violence, homelessness, and countless other issues. By bringing her personal warmth to these causes, she had helped reduce stigma and encourage people to seek help who might not have done so otherwise. Her legacy lived on in the changed attitudes and increased support for the charitable organizations she had championed. The conversation turned to how they had tried to honor Diana's memory through their own work. William spoke about his involvement with homelessness charities, explaining how his mother's early visits to homeless shelters had opened his eyes to the complexity of the issue. Diana had taught him that homelessness wasn't just about housing, but about mental health, addiction, domestic violence, and unemployment. This understanding had shaped his approach to tackling the problem as an adult. He also discussed how Diana's work with children had influenced his focus on early childhood development. His mother had understood intuitively that the first years of a child's life were crucial for their future well-being. She had spent countless hours with children in hospitals, schools, and care facilities, always focusing on making them feel valued and heard. This had inspired William's later work on mental health and his commitment to ensuring all children had the best possible start in life. Harry reflected on how his military service and his work with veterans had been influenced by Diana's compassion for those who served others. His mother had always had tremendous respect for service members and had instilled in her sons an understanding that military service was one of the highest forms of duty to country. Her example of serving others had motivated Harry to serve in the military himself and later to found the Invictus Games for wounded veterans. Both brothers spoke about how Diana's approach to parenting had shaped their own relationships with their children. Diana had been affectionate, present, and emotionally available in ways that were revolutionary for royal parents of her generation. She had prioritized her children's happiness and emotional development over strict protocol, and both William and Harry had tried to bring the same warmth and engagement to their own parenting. William described how he tried to give his children the same sense of normalcy that Diana had worked so hard to provide for him and Harry. This meant family bike rides, movie nights, and trips to the playground, just like Diana had insisted on McDonald's visits and theme park adventures. He wanted Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis to understand their responsibilities, but also to experience the joy and freedom of childhood. Harry spoke about how becoming a father had given him an even deeper appreciation for what Diana had accomplished as a mother. Balancing the demands of royal life with the needs of young children was enormously challenging, he noted, but Diana had managed to make her sons feel like they were always her top priority. This had required tremendous skill and dedication, and Harry had gained new respect for his mother's achievement as he navigated parenthood himself. The interview moved to discussing Diana's influence on their marriages and their choices of partners. Both brothers acknowledged that their mother's example had shaped what they looked for in romantic relationships. Diana had taught them the importance of emotional intelligence, compassion, and authenticity in a partner. They had both been drawn to women who shared their mother's values and commitment to service. William spoke about how Catherine had embraced Diana's legacy while also bringing her own strengths to royal life. Like Diana, Catherine connected naturally with people from all walks of life and brought genuine warmth to her public engagements. But she had also brought stability and calm that provided a strong foundation for their family life. William felt confident that Diana would have loved Catherine and would have been proud to see how she had stepped into her role as a future queen. Harry discussed how Meghan had shared Diana's passion for humanitarian work and her willingness to use her platform to advocate for important causes. Both women had faced significant media scrutiny, and Harry felt that his mother would have understood the challenges Meghan had encountered in adapting to royal life. Diana's experience of feeling isolated and misunderstood within the institution would have made her a valuable source of support for Meghan. The conversation turned to one of the most emotional topics of the entire documentary, their regrets about Diana never meeting their wives and children. William's voice grew quiet as he spoke about how much he wished his mother could have met Catherine and their children. Diana would have been an extraordinary grandmother, he said, full of energy, mischief, and unconditional love. She would have spoiled the children terribly and would have been their biggest champion in everything they did. Harry echoed these sentiments, adding that he often wondered what advice Diana would have given him about marriage and parenthood. His mother had been so wise about relationships and had always known exactly what to say when he was struggling. Her absence during these major life milestones had been one of the most painful aspects of losing her at such a young age. Both brothers spoke about how they tried to keep Diana's presence alive in their families through stories, photos, and traditions. William described how he had hung pictures of Diana throughout their home so that his children would grow up seeing their grandmother's face every day. He told them bedtime stories about Diana's adventures and made sure they understood that she would have loved them completely. Harry shared that he often talked to Diana's photo when he was facing difficult decisions, imagining what advice she might give. He had created rituals to honor her memory, like visiting her grave on important anniversaries and leaving flowers that he knew she would have loved. These practices helped him feel connected to his mother despite her physical absence. As the documentary neared its end, both princes reflected on what they hoped people would take away from their conversations. William emphasized that he wanted the world to remember Diana as she truly was, not perfect, but real, loving, and committed to making a difference. She had been a mother first, a humanitarian second, and a royal figure third, despite how these roles were often portrayed in the media. Harry added that he hoped their stories would encourage people to be more open about their own struggles and to seek help when they needed it. Diana's willingness to be vulnerable about her mental health challenges had been ahead of its time, and her sons wanted to continue her work of reducing stigma around emotional difficulties. Both brothers acknowledged that sharing these memories had been emotionally challenging, but ultimately healing. They had spent years protecting their private grief and their personal memories of Diana, but opening up had allowed them to honor their mother in a new way. They hoped that by sharing the real Diana, the loving mother, the compassionate humanitarian, the complex woman, they could ensure that her true legacy would be preserved for future generations. The final question asked them what they thought Diana would say if she could see them now. William smiled for the first time in hours, saying he thought his mother would be proud of the men they had become, but would probably tease them about taking themselves too seriously. She would be thrilled about her grandchildren and would be planning elaborate adventures with them, probably driving their security teams to distraction in the process. Harry laughed, agreeing that Diana would be focused entirely on the grandchildren she had never met. She would be on the floor playing with them, teaching them pranks to play on their parents, and filling their lives with the same joy and mischief that had made William and Harry's childhood so special despite its challenges. As the cameras stopped rolling for the final time, both brothers sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the weight of what they had accomplished over the past week. They had told their mother's story in their own words, preserving her memory not as a saint or a victim, but as the loving, complex, extraordinary woman who had shaped them into the men they had become. Diana's legacy would live on not just in the charitable causes she had championed, but in the values she had instilled in her sons and the love she had given them that continued to guide their lives more than 2 decades after her death.